September 1944 arrives with the map in chef headquarters still warm from constant handling, pins advancing, arrows lengthening, front lines sliding east as if pulled by momentum alone. Paris has been liberated, Brussels is in Allied hands, and the rhetoric of the war's end begins to creep into briefings. But behind the confident ink strokes lies a quieter picture. Fuel dumps running low, truck columns stretched to exhaustion, and infantry units pausing not because they have been beaten, but because the road behind them has grown thin. At Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters, the pressure takes the shape of paper. Plans are argued not only on operational grounds, but on the urgency of national meaning. Who will deliver the decisive blow? Whose army will be remembered as the spearhead? A message is drafted with the careful firmness of a man who knows that words can move more than divisions. It reads like a request, but carries the weight of leverage. It suggests that the issue is no longer merely the distribution of supplies or the selection of an axis of advance. It hints that the question is bigger than any one commander. Dwight D. Eisenhower reads it with the instincts of a coalition politician as much as a soldier. He has commanded by persuasion, patience, and the authority lent by agreement rather than tradition. He can tolerate disagreement. He has built an entire alliance on managing it, but he cannot tolerate a second chain of command forming in the shadows. Strategy can be debated. Legitimacy cannot. And in the corners of the room, staff officers sense it too, trading brief looks over a single phrase that feels out of place on a battlefield map. I'll take it to London. The German army is retreating, but not dissolving. It falls back behind rivers and ruined bridges, leaving mines, roadblocks, and disciplined rearguards that turn every mile into labor. Yet within the Allied command, a different contest begins, less visible, more dangerous in its own way. Who gets the fuel now decides who gets the future, and who gets the future may decide how the war is remembered. Across the Channel, Winston Churchill hears the rumble of this dispute before it breaks into public sound. He understands that coalitions do not always collapse under artillery. Sometimes they fracture under pride, under impatience, under the temptation to win an argument instead of a war. And now, one threatened appeal to Parliament hangs in the air like a match struck too close to ammunition. Because if that threat succeeds even once, the command system that made D-Day possible may not survive the victory it was built to achieve. In June 1944, before the first landing craft ground into the sand and before the smoke of Normandy rose into the English sky, Winston Churchill stood in the House of Commons and spoke of Overlord as more than an assault. It was, he implied, an experiment in orchestration. Courage would be demanded from every man who stepped into the surf, but courage alone could not coordinate navies, air forces, armor, engineers, and supply, drawn from different flags, different habits, different memories of the last war. Britain had fought alone long enough to understand that the new weapon was not merely steel, it was unity, disciplined into a single plan. That is why Eisenhower's title mattered. Supreme Commander was not ceremonial language designed for headlines. It was a constitutional compromise forged in wartime. It meant that the coalition, Britain, America, Canada, and others, had agreed to place one voice above the reflexes of national pride. In theory, it was simple. In practice, it required something rarer than bravery, restraint. The old empires and the rising ones would have to accept that orders could come from outside their own traditions, and that victory would be shared even when glory felt uneven. For Britain, Montgomery became the human face of this arrangement. He was visible, confident, and already known to the public as the commander who had helped turn disaster into endurance in North Africa. In the first phase of the land battle, he was elevated not only because of operational planning, but because Britain needed a morale anchor, a figure who could reassure a nation that had spent years under rationing, bombing, and uncertainty. He did not merely command armies. He carried a portion of Britain's pride on his shoulders. But while Britain guarded dignity, American power was swelling into dominance. By the summer of 1944, the United States was putting more divisions into the field, more trucks onto roads, and more aircraft into the sky than any ally could match. And with that power came an impatience that was not personal, but structural. The impatience of a vast machine built for movement, funded by a public that wanted an ending, not another slow grinding campaign. So the hidden bargain formed beneath the speeches and the salutes. Britain would keep stature, America would get momentum, and Eisenhower would keep control, because without control, momentum becomes chaos. On D-Day's eve, troops climbed into cramped craft and tightened chin straps, believing the chain of command was settled, permanent, unquestioned. They did not know how fragile such agreements could become once the battlefield shifted from beaches to politics. Because if that chain were ever challenged, if authority could be outflanked by appeal, then the moral logic of overlord would crack, and the alliance would discover that unity is a weapon that can be disarmed without firing a shot. When Normandy finally broke open in late July 1944, after the hedgerows, the artillery, the slow attrition of a battlefield measured in fields, the war seemed to change its tempo. The German front buckled, the Falaise pocket closed with thousands trapped inside, and suddenly France began to fall in chapters. Towns liberated, bridges seized, crowds appearing with tricolor flags as Allied columns rolled through dust and late summer heat. The maps in headquarters rooms filled with confident arrows again, as if the invasion had unlocked a straight road to the Rhine. But the war's arithmetic changed as the distance grew. Every mile east did not simply move the front line, it stretched every tether behind it. Fuel, ammunition, food, replacement parts, medical supplies, engineer stores. The Allies possessed immense industrial power, but industrial power had to be translated into tonnage delivered on time, over roads cratered by retreating demolition and crowded by their own success. Trucks wore out, tires shredded, engines failed, rail lines needed repair. Logistics stopped being a background function and became, quietly, the new battlefield. Antwerp was captured in early September, one of Europe's great ports taken intact, a prize that looked like salvation on any map. Yet a port on paper is not a port in practice. The Scheldt estuary remained in German hands, mined and defended, and without clearing that long, watery throat, Antwerp could not breathe. Supplies still had to pour through Normandy's beaches and the artificial Mulberry harbors, then crawl forward along roads that were never built for an army's hunger. The Allies had seized a door, but the keyhole was still held by the enemy. And the enemy, though retreating, was not collapsing. German formations pulled back with discipline, reforming behind rivers and canal lines, leaving mines, blown culverts, and small rearguards that forced the Allies to fight for time in minutes and hours rather than in grand battles. It was managed delay, the art of losing ground while preserving force, and of turning Allied speed into Allied exhaustion. Inside Schaff, arguments sharpened into something more than professional disagreement. Do you pour everything into one concentrated thrust and try to end it with a single decisive blow? Or do you keep pressure everywhere, accepting slower progress as the price of flexibility? The debate sounded theoretical until it reached the front lines. There, a unit could halt in the open, no dramatic defeat, no encirclement, no broken morale, just empty jerry cans and silent engines. Success stalled by supply. And in that silence, a new truth became unavoidable. The next crisis of the war would not begin with gunfire, but with allocation, who gets the fuel, and therefore, who gets the future. By early September 1944, Bernard Montgomery's argument took on the shape of a straight line. While the Allied front widened across France and Belgium, he insisted that width was a kind of self-inflicted weakness. The war, he believed, did not need more pressure everywhere. It needed one concentrated drive, narrow, supplied, protected, and relentless. aimed like a spear at the German heartland. In his mind, speed would not come from dispersion and improvisation, but from focus, fuel, ammunition, and priority given to a single army group so it could move fast enough to end the war before winter rewrote the campaign. Montgomery framed the moment as fleeting. Germany, he argued, was still staggering from Normandy's collapse and the chaos of the retreat. A broad advance, with its divided depots and competing demands, would only allow the enemy to recover. It would turn a chase into a crawl. The Allies, after years of preparation, had finally purchased momentum with blood and material. Why squander it by advancing on a wide front, where every river line would become a new argument, every shortage a reason to slow? Better to strike once, hard enough that the enemy never finds his footing again. For Britain, this logic carried a second meaning. A British-led decisive blow would be more than a military choice. It would be a restoration of stature. By 1944, the balance of power inside the alliance had shifted unmistakably. American divisions were arriving in numbers Britain could not match, and American logistics were becoming the war's circulatory system. Montgomery's plan offered Britain a kind of narrative salvation, a final act in which British arms could be seen, by the world and by Parliament, as the sharp edge of victory rather than a declining partner carried by larger forces. Morale, at home and in the ranks, attached itself to the promise of one final, clear triumph. Montgomery himself had learned to survive wartime scrutiny through certainty. He had been elevated, criticized, praised, and watched by politicians, by newspapers, by the public hungry for reassurance after years of strain. Clarity for him was not merely a leadership style, it was armor. He spoke as a commander who believed that doubts were contagious, that ambiguity invited hesitation, and that hesitation cost lives. In his view, a plan should be simple enough to be remembered and firm enough to be defended against any rival interpretation. But across the coalition table, American ears often heard something different. They heard a proposal that would elevate British prestige at the possible expense of coalition balance, one that demanded disproportionate resources and implied that other advances would become secondary by necessity. To Americans who were supplying much of the fuel and manpower now filling the front, the question was not whether Montgomery's thrust was bold. It was whether it was fair, and whether boldness justified reshaping a command system designed to prevent precisely this kind of national competition. Inside Montgomery's staff tent, confidence was treated like discipline. Maps were laid out with the clean geometry of intention. Briefings carried the tone of decisions already made. Doubt was not explored, it was corrected. In that atmosphere, belief began to harden into something sharper. If the plan was obvious, then resistance could only be explained in darker terms, either incompetence or politics. And once a commander begins to think that way, the war is no longer fought only against the enemy ahead, but against the allies beside him. The spear point was being sharpened, and with it, the question that would soon consume the alliance. When one man is certain, who is allowed to say no? To Dwight Eisenhower, the argument was never only about geography. It arrived wrapped in maps and tonnage tables, but underneath it, he heard something older and more fragile. The question of whether the alliance could still think as one body. A strategy debate, in a coalition, was rarely just a strategy debate. It was a referendum on trust. The Western Allies had crossed the Channel together because they had accepted a single authority above national instinct. If that authority fractured now, when victory seemed close enough to touch, then the war could still be lost in the only way a superior coalition can lose, by pulling itself apart. Eisenhower's own preference leaned away from single, narrow wagers. He had seen enough of war's appetite for surprise to distrust any plan that depended on one corridor staying open, one timetable staying true, one enemy reaction staying predictable. A broad front advance was not simply caution, it was insurance. Multiple pressures created multiple dilemmas for the Germans, forced them to spread what little strength remained, and offered the Allies alternatives when roads clogged, bridges fell, or an unexpected counterattack cut into a flank. One concentrated thrust could be brilliant, until the enemy chose the one place to resist and strangled the entire effort with mines, artillery, and a few intact panzer divisions. He also carried, quietly, the weight of America's political clock. The United States was fighting a war on two oceans, and its public had been promised purpose and progress. In 1944, an election loomed. Across the country, families counted casualties and asked how long this war would demand sons and husbands. Demobilization pressure was already real, even before the fighting ended. An expectation that victory would mean ships turning home, factories shifting, lives resuming. Eisenhower understood that the nation could endure sacrifice, but it would not forgive a catastrophe that looked avoidable, an ambitious gamble that turned triumph into a new disaster. At the same time, he understood Britain's exhaustion in a way that statistics could not fully capture. Britain had been at war since 1939. Its manpower pool was thinner, its divisions older in composition, its reserves near the edge. Each British loss carried a heavier national weight than an American loss, not morally, but mathematically. And in that exhaustion lay a delicate problem. Britain needed dignity and visible influence to remain committed in spirit, yet the alliance's material reality was now unmistakably American. Eisenhower's task was to hold those truths together without allowing either to become a weapon. In conference rooms and headquarters corridors, he watched subordinates argue, Bradley's calm logic, Patton's impatience, Montgomery's certainty, and the lesson that emerged was not that disagreement was dangerous. Disagreement could be productive. The real threat was disobedience. The moment a commander decided that persuasion was optional, that the chain of command could be bent by personality or bypassed by politics. Eisenhower treated legitimacy like a battlefield asset. Without it, orders became requests. Requests became negotiations, and negotiations, under strain, became paralysis. A supreme commander who could be circumvented was no supreme commander at all, only the man asked to reconcile everyone else's ambitions until the war ran out of time. And so the tension narrowed, turning personal, because principles always become personal when they are tested. Montgomery wanted priority, fuel, supplies, the right to be the spear. Eisenhower wanted something colder and harder to compromise, the rule that no one, however celebrated, bypasses the supreme commander. And the closer the Allies moved toward Germany, the more that rule would be tempted by impatience, because the next argument would not be about maps, but about power. Montgomery's frustration did not arrive as a tantrum. It arrived as an implication, spoken with the measured confidence of a man used to being listened to and used to being obeyed. In the late summer atmosphere of 1944, when the front raced east but the fuel columns lagged behind, advocacy could easily sharpen into pressure. Montgomery had argued his case repeatedly: a narrow thrust, priority of supply, a decisive blow. But when those arguments met Eisenhower's refusal to grant him primacy, Montgomery began to hint at something beyond persuasion. He suggested, in essence, that if the military chain would not yield, the political one might. One word carried the weight of that shift: Parliament. In a normal war, Parliament was where the nation argued policy and measured sacrifice. In a coalition war, it was also the symbol of legitimacy, the democratic foundation beneath armies in the field. To invoke it inside a strategic dispute was to move the argument onto a different battlefield entirely. It was no longer a question of which route to take toward Germany. It was a question of who held authority to decide. And once that question is opened, it rarely closes neatly. Around Montgomery, some British advisors could sense opportunity in the tension. Public opinion in Britain still watched the campaign closely, hungry for signs that the nation's endurance since 1940 would culminate in visible leadership. If Parliament could be stirred, if Churchill's government could be pressed, or if the press could be fed the right kind of impatience, then pressure might rise on Chef to allocate supplies differently. It was the oldest temptation in coalition warfare, to win operational priority not by proving the plan, but by making refusal politically costly. Across the table, Americans heard something colder. They heard betrayal, not of strategy, but of the bargain that made strategy possible. The Supreme Commander system had been designed precisely to prevent this kind of national maneuver, to ensure that disagreements were solved inside headquarters, not in capitals. If one partner could threaten to go to London when disappointed, then every future dispute would follow the same path. An alliance cannot function if command is decided by whoever has the loudest microphone at home. In the staff rooms where cables were drafted and redrafted, the danger became tangible. A single sentence could carry consequences that artillery could not repair. One officer, pen hovering, understood the trap. Write it too strongly, and it becomes an ultimatum. Write it too softly, and it becomes a wink. In war, ambiguity is sometimes useful with enemies. With allies, it is corrosive. The cable, once sent, could not be recalled, and the words would move faster than any convoy. Eisenhower's inner alarm sounded not because he feared argument, but because he understood precedent. If political escalation worked once, if it even appeared to work, then headquarters would no longer be the place where wars were directed. London, Washington, and eventually Moscow would become the real command posts, and generals would become emissaries, not leaders. The battlefield would be governed by negotiations that never ended, because politics does not offer the finality that military decisions demand. This was the moment Montgomery's belief edged toward arrogance. He began to act as if victory or proximity to it granted him a second chain of command, one made not of ranks and orders, but of public pressure and national pride. And in that quiet escalation lay a threat more fragile than any bridgehead. The possibility that the Allies might reach Germany still united in arms, yet divided in authority. The question was no longer whether Montgomery's plan would succeed. The question was whether the alliance could survive the method he was now willing to use to obtain it, because in London, one man would soon have to decide what mattered more, a commander's certainty, or the system that made certainty subordinate to unity. In the late summer of 1944, the Allied advance began to outpace its own anatomy. Maps made it look effortless, arrows sweeping across France, the front line leaping forward in days what had once taken weeks. But armies do not move on ink. They move on bearings, brake pads, fuel pumps, and the stubborn endurance of machines built for roads that were now crowded, cratered, and exhausted. Trucks broke under nonstop use. Tires shredded on rubble and overheated asphalt. Bridges failed under weights they were never designed to bear. And with each mile gained, depots fell farther behind, like a heartbeat weakening as the body runs faster than its lungs can fill. This was the hidden science of war, the conversion of national industry into daily survival at the front. Without ammunition, a division becomes noise without force. Without food, it becomes tired men holding rifles that feel heavier by the hour. And without fuel, it becomes a statue. Armor parked at the roadside, engines silent, crews waiting for a convoy that may not arrive. Strategy in September 1944 was no longer only about where to strike. It was about what could be fed, what could be repaired, what could be kept moving. Ports, therefore, became more decisive than parades or proclamations. They were not just places ships unloaded, they were engines that powered entire fronts. Every day, thousands of tons had to be brought in and pushed forward. Shells, rations, spare parts, medical supplies, bridging equipment, winter clothing not yet issued. The great irony was that the Allies possessed abundance, yet abundance still had to travel through narrow channels, limited dock space, damaged rail lines, roads choked with traffic. Without ports close to the front, the war became a long-distance hauling contest, and long-distance hauling bleeds time, vehicles, and men. Antwerp seemed to offer an escape from that trap. Captured early in September with its facilities largely intact, it looked like a gift from fortune, one of Europe's finest harbors, closer to the front than the beaches of Normandy. But the promise of Antwerp remained trapped by geography and by German guns. The Scheldt estuary, the waterway leading to the port, was still held, mined, and defended. Until it was cleared, Antwerp was a warehouse with the doors locked. Unlocking it would demand time, deliberate operations, and grinding battles through lowlands where water and mud could be as obstructive as fortifications. A port could be taken in a day. Making it usable could take months. Meanwhile, German resilience returned in practical forms, the way a wounded animal still finds ways to bite. Mines appeared on roads and in fields. Flooded ground forced vehicles into predictable routes where artillery could find them. Rear guards held canal lines long enough for larger formations to regroup behind rivers. And when the opportunity appeared, a thin flank, a rushed crossing, a supply column exposed, there were sudden counterstrokes, sharp and localized, designed not always to win ground, but to cost the Allies what they could least afford: time and momentum. So innovation became less a matter of genius than necessity. Forced improvisation performed at scale. Convoys were rerouted along secondary roads. Engineers built and rebuilt bridges under pressure. Railways were repaired in relentless cycles. Track laid, lines reopened, then cut again by sabotage or combat. Emergency pipelines were pushed forward to reduce dependence on trucks, because trucks were dying faster than they could be replaced. Repair shops ran around the clock, coaxing one more day from a gearbox, one more journey from a tire. At headquarters, debates about priority were never abstract, because every priority meant thousands of vehicles and men diverted from someone else's needs. Far from the conference tables, the war's reality was carried by individuals whose names would never appear in communiques. On a blacked-out road at night, a driver guided a fuel truck through dim, hazard-marked bends, headlights hooded, the cab smelling of petrol and sweat. He could not see the front, but the front depended on him. If he made a wrong turn, a battalion might not move at dawn. If he was delayed by a blown culvert, a planned assault might become a pause. His cargo was not merely fuel. It was tomorrow's strategy, sloshing in a metal tank, vulnerable to accident, ambush, or simple exhaustion. And here was the truth that reframed the argument inside Schaff. The idea of one thrust implied more than boldness. It implied a wager against physics. It assumed that roads, bridges, ports, and supply chains could be bent to will as easily as arrows drawn on a map. But the war was revealing a colder lesson. Speed is not only a decision, it is a capacity. And capacity is built from infrastructure, not intention. In the days ahead, as commanders gathered and tempers tightened, the alliance would discover that the real fight was not simply over where to advance, but over who had the right to decide when the mathematics of supply refused to obey anyone's pride. In Brussels, the rooms where the senior commanders gathered were orderly, almost domestic in their restraint. Tables cleared, maps unfolded, tea and cigarettes offered with the practiced etiquette of Allied officers who knew they were being watched by history. But beneath that polite surface, the argument had sharpened into something surgical. Outside, the city carried the aftertaste of liberation. Damaged streets, cautious celebrations, the constant movement of military traffic. Inside, the air was quieter, heavier, filled with the sense that the war's next step would be decided not only by enemy resistance, but by the ability of allies to remain governed by their own rules. Montgomery pressed again for concentration and priority, and he did so with the clarity that made him effective in battle and abrasive in coalition rooms. He wanted the supplies, fuel, ammunition, transport, channeled into a single decisive drive. To him, this was logic. A narrow thrust would end the war sooner, prevent the enemy from reorganizing, and spare lives by shortening the campaign. He spoke as if the conclusion were already proven, as if disagreement were merely a refusal to accept the obvious. Eisenhower listened with the patience of a man accustomed to managing strong personalities, but his answers grew firmer. He insisted on coalition balance and operational resilience, not because he lacked ambition, but because he feared fragility. A plan that depended on one corridor remaining open was vulnerable to one German decision. A plan that starved other armies to feed a single spear might create spectacular progress for a time, but would also create exposed flanks, idle forces, and the political bitterness that follows perceived favoritism. Eisenhower's war was larger than any one arrow on a map. It was the maintenance of an alliance under stress, because the alliance itself was the instrument that made victory possible. At a certain point, the disagreement stopped being about routes and rivers and became about permission. Who, in this coalition, was allowed to decide the map? The question was not spoken openly at first. It did not need to be. It hovered in the pauses between sentences, in the weight of a commander insisting and another refusing. Because in a national army, authority can be taken for granted. In a coalition, authority must be continuously affirmed, or it begins to evaporate. Then Montgomery, in one form or another, hinted again at what lay beyond the conference room. He suggested that if his plan could not win priority through shaft channels, it could be pursued through London, through politics, through Parliament, through the currents of public opinion that governments could never fully ignore. It was not an outright mutiny. It was something subtler and therefore more dangerous. The implication that military persuasion might be replaced by political escalation. In effect, it offered an alternative route around Eisenhower's authority, a second ladder to climb when the first one did not lead to the desired door. For the Americans present, the meaning was unmistakable. Coalition command could not survive if one partner used domestic institutions as leverage against the agreed commander. If disagreements could be carried to capitals like complaints, then generals would begin to fight two wars at once, one against Germany and one against each other's governments. The chain of command, already strained by distance and logistics, would become a chain in name only. In the corners of the room, aides and staff officers watched faces more than they listened to words. They knew the language of formal disagreement, the ritual exchange of views that could end in compromise. But they also knew the moment when a relationship fractures by a single degree, when courtesy remains, but confidence drains away. A glance held too long, a pause that feels like refusal, a tightening around the eyes when a familiar argument is repeated, not to persuade, but to wear the other man down. These small signals mattered, because large alliances rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. They erode. Eisenhower's position hardened into a principle that could not be negotiated. A commander cannot be supreme if he can be outflanked by speeches. If Montgomery could appeal over his head, and if that appeal succeeded, then Eisenhower's authority would become conditional, dependent on whether it pleased national pride. And once authority becomes conditional, it is no longer authority. It is a suggestion with a title attached. The meeting ended without a clean resolution, and that lack of closure carried its own sound. A quiet warning that the struggle had moved beyond operational preference. The most dangerous battlefield, the Allies were learning, is not always the one marked by minefields and artillery. Sometimes it is the one where allies begin to question the rules that keep them allies. And somewhere across the Channel, in London, the dispute was beginning to look less like a staff problem and more like a crisis of state. In London, the reports arrived with an edge that made them hard to misread. This was no longer a contained disagreement between professionals, no longer the ordinary friction of strong commanders competing over priorities. The dispute had begun to leak toward the one place it could do the most damage: public politics. Montgomery's frustration, once expressed as operational insistence, now carried the faint but unmistakable odor of escalation. The suggestion that if the Supreme Commander would not yield, Westminster might be made to speak. Winston Churchill understood at once why the temptation existed. Britain had endured the long years when the island stood alone, when the Atlantic convoys were lifelines, and the Luftwaffe's raids were nightly arithmetic. By 1944, that endurance demanded recognition, not merely gratitude, but visible influence at the table where Europe's future was being shaped. A British decisive blow had an emotional logic that would play well in the Commons and on the street. In a democracy at war, morale is not an ornament, it is a resource. But Churchill also understood what had changed since 1940, and he was too experienced to pretend otherwise. America was now the material backbone of the Western War. Divisions arriving in depth, factories feeding fronts across oceans, transport fleets and air forces on a scale Britain could not replicate. Britain could still lead, still advise, still contribute brilliance and steel. But it could not afford to look like it was trying to bend the alliance by political pressure. The moment Britain appeared to be undermining American command, the coalition's center of gravity would shift, not toward London, but away from it. And beyond the Atlantic Partnership, Churchill felt another set of eyes fixed on the West. Stalin was watching everything, every delay, every disagreement, every hint that the democracies could not keep discipline inside their own arrangements. Any Western split was strategic oxygen for Soviet leverage, at the front now, and at the conference tables that would redraw Europe after Germany fell. Unity was not only a military necessity, it was a diplomatic position. If it cracked, it would not be Germany alone who benefited. In his office, Churchill weighed words the way a gunner weighs shells. Not because he loved drama, but because he understood consequences. A sentence, correctly aimed, could save a relationship. A sentence, carelessly placed, could detonate pride. The dilemma was stark. Defend Montgomery too strongly and insult Eisenhower, the man holding the coalition together day by day. Defend Eisenhower too bluntly and wound Britain's pride, turning a necessary correction into a domestic grievance that Parliament could amplify. So Churchill chose the priority that kept the war winnable. The alliance must appear indivisible, not as theater, but as policy, because appearances shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. He could allow debate. He could not allow a precedent. Parliament could not become a lever pulled against Scaife, not even once. And with that decision made, the pressure turned into purpose. Churchill began preparing a message designed to kill the threat without humiliating the man who had voiced it, ending the temptation to go to London while leaving the strategic argument alive. The question now was not what he would say, but how sharply he would draw the line. Churchill did not treat the matter as a quarrel between temperaments. Privately, he framed it as something more serious, almost constitutional. In war, a democracy must argue, that is its nature. But an army cannot be commanded by debate staged for an audience. If a field marshal could threaten to carry operational disputes into Parliament, then the distinction between civilian oversight and battlefield direction would blur at the worst possible moment. It would turn the House of Commons into a pressure valve for military disappointment, and once opened, it would never fully close again. He returned, in his mind, to the quiet logic that had made Overlord possible. The invasion had not succeeded by British daring alone, nor by American weight alone, but by a carefully maintained discipline, unity under a supreme commander. That unity was not sentimental. It was technological, almost mechanical, like a complex engine that only works if every part accepts the same timing. Troops could storm beaches because navies, air forces, and armies had been harmonized under one operational voice. If that voice could be outflanked now, in the very months when Germany's defenses still had teeth, then the hidden invention of D-Day, coalition command, would be dismantled in slow motion. Churchill also understood Montgomery in the way only a wartime leader can understand his most useful men, as both asset and risk. Montgomery had real gifts. He imposed order, conserved strength, and spoke with the kind of certainty that steadied frightened nations. He could take a complicated battlefield and make it legible to exhausted soldiers. But Churchill also recognized the other side of that certainty, the way it could harden into a belief that dissent was sabotage, that delay was betrayal, that anyone who disagreed must be either incompetent or political. In a national army, such conviction can be dangerous. In a coalition, it can be corrosive. At his desk, Churchill considered the fragile psychology of nations. Morale, he knew, could turn as quickly as weather. Pride could become resentment with only a small push, a careless phrase, a public slight, an implication that one partner was being used rather than respected. Britain needed dignity, not merely for vanity, but because dignity kept a tired people willing to carry the burden. Yet America needed something too, not deference, but fairness, proof that the alliance's rules applied equally, even when famous men tested them. That is why Churchill chose to back Eisenhower's authority. Without it, every future operation would become a negotiation conducted under threat. Threat of resignation, threat of headlines, threat of parliamentary spectacle. The war would be directed not by unified command, but by competing centers of gravity, each pulling resources toward itself. Germany could be beaten that way, perhaps, but the alliance might not survive the process, and the post-war balance would be decided by whoever watched the fracture most patiently from the east. Here, the moral irony revealed itself. The very shortcut that seemed to defend Britain's standing, using Parliament as leverage, would, in the long run, diminish Britain's influence. It would make Britain look insecure, willing to undermine the agreed system rather than lead within it. Churchill understood that Britain's dignity was best protected by refusing to purchase it at the price of coalition legitimacy. So, the turning point locked into place. Churchill would not allow Parliament to become a weapon against Chef, not once, not even as a threat. The question now was how he would say it, with enough firmness to end the temptation, and enough craft to keep pride from turning into open defiance. And the words he chose would soon reach Montgomery like a closed door finally clicked shut. Churchill's reply did not read like a friendly intervention. It read like boundary setting, measured, unmistakable, and constructed with the logic of command rather than the warmth of persuasion. In essence, he drew a line between two things that can look similar in wartime: legitimate argument and corrosive defiance. Strategy, he implied, must be fought out where strategy belongs, between commanders, inside the agreed machinery of coalition command, not in newspapers, not through hints, not by summoning Parliament as if it were an auxiliary headquarters. At the center of the message was a principle Churchill treated as non-negotiable. Eisenhower's authority as supreme commander was the foundation stone of the entire Western effort. Coalition war could not be conducted as a federation of egos, each with its own escape hatch to its capital. It required one operational voice, imperfect at times, delayed at times, but singular. Once that voice could be outflanked by public pressure, it would cease to be a voice of command at all. It would become only one opinion among many, and the war would revert to the very national rivalries the enemy hoped to exploit. Churchill did not deny Montgomery's frustration. He acknowledged the strain, the hunger for decision, the impatience that comes when victory feels close, yet refuses to arrive on schedule. But he refused to grant the frustration a new pathway. Whatever Montgomery wished to argue, priority, concentration, urgency, must be argued in the proper channel, as a soldier among soldiers, not as a national symbol threatening to pull the political alarm bell. When Montgomery read the response, he understood what had happened. London, which he had implied could be a lever, was now a locked door. The ladder had been removed. Whatever pressure he hoped to generate through Westminster would not be allowed to form. because Churchill had decided that a short-term victory in a staff dispute was not worth the long-term damage of a precedent. And beneath the formal restraint of Churchill's words lay a deeper meaning that every experienced politician could hear. Britain would not win the war by weakening the mechanism that kept America committed, coordinated, and confident in the partnership. The alliance was not merely helpful, it was indispensable. Undermine it, and Britain would inherit not leadership, but isolation. In that reversal was Churchill's quiet protection of Montgomery himself. By stopping the impulse to escalate, he preserved Montgomery's usefulness as a battlefield commander and spared him the stain of appearing to challenge the very system that made his victories possible. The threat to appeal to Parliament died here, not because the strategic disagreement vanished, but because the rules were reaffirmed. And with the rules secured, Eisenhower could now offer something else. A controlled gamble, bold enough to relieve pressure, but still inside the chain of command. With Churchill's line drawn and Eisenhower's authority reinforced, the argument did not vanish, but it changed shape. The coalition had been reminded firmly where decisions were made and who carried the final responsibility. And now Eisenhower faced the second half of leadership, not only preventing a breach of discipline, but preventing stagnation. A supreme commander who says only no eventually loses the initiative to the enemy. So, with the system protected, Eisenhower offered limited space for boldness, enough to keep momentum alive, without surrendering the principle that one commander controlled the war's direction. The solution the Allies reached was a kind of compromise written in operational form, a dramatic shortcut that still remained under chaff control. Airborne ambition would be married to ground thrust. Paratroopers would seize bridges far ahead of the front, creating a corridor over rivers and canals that might otherwise demand long, grinding assaults. Then armored columns would race up that corridor, using speed as a substitute for supply depth, betting that the enemy's disorganization could be exploited before it solidified into winter defenses. It was not Montgomery's one thrust in its purest sense, but it carried the same hunger for a decisive ending. Innovation surged because the plan demanded it. Bridges were not just objectives, they were time itself. Radios, timings, drop zones, landing zones, resupply schedules, everything had to align with the precision of a machine. The corridor would be narrow, and narrow corridors punish error. Engineers prepared for emergency bridging. Planners calculated how many tons of fuel and ammunition could be pushed along a single road. Weather reports became operational forecasts. Cloud cover was no longer scenery, but fate. War, for a moment, looked less like a clash of armies and more like a mechanical race against delay. In the staging areas, paratroopers prepared with quiet ritual. They checked straps, adjusted harnesses, wrote brief letters, and packed what they could carry into the uncertain weight of a single kit. Confidence was not always loud. Often it was simply the refusal to dwell on what might happen after the green light. Fear was too heavy to pack, so it was left behind in glances, in jokes that ended quickly, in the steady hands that tried not to tremble as engines warmed on airfields in England. At first, the gamble seemed to vindicate itself. Bridges were taken, towns opened, and for a few days the old dream returned, an ending brought forward by daring and tempo. The map arrows looked honest again. But friction arrived as it always does. German resistance stiffening at key points, unexpected delays on the single highway, units fighting for crossings under fire while the clock kept moving. Timing, once the plan's greatest strength, became its greatest vulnerability. A narrow corridor that speeds success can also channel disaster. And the deeper truth asserted itself, the one logistics had been whispering for weeks. Shortcuts do not abolish supply. They merely compress the consequences. When a plan depends on speed, any delay is multiplied because the margin for error has been traded away for momentum. The faster the advance, the more catastrophic the pause. In the end, the coalition survived the command crisis. Discipline held, authority remained intact. But the battlefield began collecting the bill for the gamble that followed, and the coming arguments would no longer be theoretical. They would be counted in wounded, in bridges not taken, and in the long, cold realization that winter was still ahead. When the gamble's dust settled, it did not leave behind a clean verdict, only a ledger. Bridges taken and bridges missed, towns liberated and corridors that narrowed into choke points, and, inevitably, casualties. In coalition war, casualty figures are never only grief, they become language. Numbers are lifted from reports and turned into arguments, used to defend reputations, to accuse rivals of recklessness, or to claim that hesitation cost more lives than daring ever could. The dead are mourned, but they are also cited. So the strategic debate resumed, sharper now because it had been blooded. The questions returned with harder edges. Who was right about concentration? Who was right about breadth? Who wasted time? Who wasted men? What had once been a disagreement over logistics and options became, after the operation's mixed outcome, a dispute about judgment itself. The tone changed. Not open hostility, not yet, but the kind of tension where every briefing feels like testimony and every decision is weighed against a counterfactual that cannot be proven but can always be believed. While headquarters argued, the war's practical reality reasserted itself with indifference to pride. Antwerp returned to the center of gravity. The port still sat there, immense and silent, its potential locked behind the mined and defended approaches of the Scheldt. Winter could not be conquered by speeches. It would be decided by clearance operations, by routes made usable, by tonnage delivered day after day. Logistics, which had been treated as a constraint, now became the campaign's defining fact. The great chase had ended. The slow work of making victory sustainable had begun. In the flooded lowlands of the Netherlands, infantry fought a kind of war that never looked glamorous in communiques. Mud that swallowed boots, waterlogged fields, cold that stiffened fingers around rifles, and made every movement cost more effort than it should. Men advanced through ditches and along raised embankments, not toward dramatic breakthroughs, but toward incremental control of ground that allowed mines to be cleared and waterways to be opened. It was slow war, grinding war, the kind that rarely produces a hero's silhouette, yet decides whether armies can be fed. In London, Churchill managed Parliament carefully. He could not allow national pride to convert battlefield complexity into political sabotage. The temptation still existed to simplify setbacks into betrayal, to demand symbolic victories, to treat war as a contest of personalities rather than of constraints. Churchill understood that democracies are strongest when they argue honestly, but weakest when argument becomes a weapon used against the very machinery that makes victory possible. And so, in the months after, Eisenhower's restraint was reinterpreted. What had once looked like caution began to resemble the only sustainable discipline, an insistence that operations must be governed by capacity and alliances by rules. The consequence became clearer with time. Churchill's intervention had prevented a precedent in which every disagreement could be carried into public view, turned into a referendum, and used to break command from the inside. The battlefield was still ahead, and winter was closing in. But the alliance had survived its most dangerous temptation, the temptation to fight each other for the right to claim the ending. Churchill never doubted that Britain had to remain a leading partner in the Allied war. Leadership was not vanity for him, it was survival. A diminished Britain would have less say in Europe's future, less ability to protect its interests, and less weight in the post-war world that was already taking shape in diplomats' minds. Yet he also understood a hard limitation. Leadership cannot be purchased by bypassing the agreed commander. If Britain needed influence, it had to earn it within the coalition's rules, not by turning those rules into obstacles to be sidestepped when inconvenient. Part of that understanding came from Churchill's grasp of the American psyche. Americans would accept hardship, long supply lines, bitter fighting, casualties that filled small towns with telegrams, if they believed the burden was shared honestly. But they would not accept humiliation. They would not fight under the impression that their manpower and material were being used to purchase someone else's prestige, especially through political maneuver rather than military necessity. If Britain appeared to be using Westminster as a lever to force Chef's hand, the damage would not be confined to one decision. It would seep into every future meeting, every request for resources, every fragile act of trust. And trust, once punctured, does not heal quickly in war. Churchill also thought in terms of future history, the kind of history that becomes precedent. If Parliament could be invoked as a command tool, if it could be threatened as a way to bend coalition strategy, then the coalition would become a political hostage. Every commander with a grievance would learn the same lesson. Do not persuade the supreme commander. Pressure your capital. Do not accept a decision. Contest it publicly. That is how alliances dissolve, slowly, not through one dramatic rupture, but through the steady normalization of bypass. In one of those private moments where leaders rehearse consequences before they happen, Churchill could imagine the worst headline with painful clarity: Allies divided. It would not matter whether the division was serious or temporary. The mere appearance would be enough. German propaganda would feast on it, amplifying every crack, presenting Western unity as a facade held together by convenience rather than conviction. And the enemy's real aim, by 1944, was not necessarily to regain Paris. It was to buy time, to prolong the war until political fatigue, distrust, or separate agendas weakened the coalition that was strangling the Reich. So Churchill reframed what British influence actually meant. It was not a matter of symbolic control over a single dramatic thrust. It was endurance, Britain remaining indispensable. Indispensable through bases, air power, naval strength, intelligence, and the steady competence of a nation that had learned to fight a long war. Britain's leverage came not from demanding the spotlight, but from being the partner without whom the spotlight could not exist. In a coalition, the strongest position is often the one that does not need to announce itself. Here the moral irony deepened in a way that only wartime politics can produce. Montgomery's reputation, his place in British memory, would be secured by victories, certainly, but also by the perception that he served the larger cause rather than his own prominence. If he succeeded by undermining Eisenhower, he might win an argument and lose the respect that makes victories durable. To protect Montgomery's long-term value to Britain, Churchill had to limit Montgomery's power in the moment, closing off the political ladder before it could be climbed. And that is the quiet thesis Churchill lived by, often without saying it aloud. Coalition war is the art of denying your own impulses for the sake of shared victory. It requires nations to restrain their pride, commanders to accept limits, and leaders to choose the system over the ego, even when the ego promises a quicker, louder, more satisfying ending. Because the war could still be won by force, but only unity could decide what kind of victory it would be. The Western Allies would win the war in Europe, but the shape of that victory reveals something easy to miss if you only watch the front lines. The triumph was not only tactical, though tactics mattered. It was organizational. It was the ability of separate nations, with separate histories and separate prides, to keep functioning as one instrument long enough to break an enemy that still knew how to punish mistakes. Guns and aircraft could destroy German divisions. Only disciplined cooperation could prevent the coalition itself from becoming a second battlefield. In that light, Churchill's refusal becomes more than a moment of political firmness. It becomes a model of wartime statesmanship. The willingness to protect the chain of command even when doing so bruises national pride and irritates celebrated men. Democracies must argue, and they must oversee their generals, but they cannot allow constitutional institutions to be turned into tactical levers. Once Parliament becomes a tool of operational pressure, the war stops being directed. It becomes contested, inside the very alliance that claims to be united. Montgomery remains, even in hindsight, brilliant and controversial. He could impose order on chaos, and he could inspire confidence through clarity. But his story also proves a harder truth. Talent does not exempt anyone from rules. In a coalition, brilliance must live inside structure, because structure is what prevents brilliance from becoming rivalry. Montgomery's certainty could win battles. It could also, if unchecked, strain the alliance that made those battles meaningful. Eisenhower's authority, often described as administrative, is revealed as something more important: quiet architecture. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but load-bearing. It was the framework that allowed Americans, Britons, Canadians, and others to fight as a single force without constantly renegotiating the meaning of command. In war, architecture is destiny. A cracked beam does not announce itself until the roof begins to sag. Years later, veterans rarely remembered the meetings in Brussels or the cables drafted in headquarters. They remembered winter nights, mud and cold, the long waits, the sense that wars last longer when unity slips and momentum dies. They understood, without needing the language of politics, that the enemy was not the only thing that could slow an advance. Allies could do that too, if pride replaced discipline. And that is the moral closure this episode leaves behind. The most dangerous ambition is not the one that charges forward under fire, but the one that uses democracy's institutions as leverage in war, because it corrodes legitimacy while claiming to defend it. He threatened to carry the war into Parliament, until Churchill reminded him the chain of command was the only bridge the Allies could not afford to lose.